Well, I thank the chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for appearing before the committee. And I want to address a couple of issues. I know, Chairman Green, you brought up your service. I just want to echo just one more time your fidelity to the Constitution of the United States and the laws of the United States, which were being questioned earlier, I think, inappropriately, based on your past service in the military, service here in the United States Congress. And I just want to ask if there's anything else you want to reiterate about your lifetime of service and commitment to the Constitution of the United States and the laws of the United States.
Thank you.
So thank you, sir. Let me just say a couple of points of observation. And I'd ask Chairman Green if you agree that what we're seeing at the southern border, what we're seeing happen due to open borders, is unprecedented.
Yeah, there's nothing in our history that rivals the depth and breadth of the crisis at the southern border, where foreign agents, not of a government, but of the Mexican cartels, have seized control of the southern border, where, 150,000 dead Americans. I mean, we lost 54,000, I think it was, in Vietnam in a 10-year war. In 2 years, we've lost 150,000 people to fentanyl. The cartels have metastasized throughout our country. It's unprecedented. And I'll also say, in terms of the actions of the secretary, all the previous secretaries attempted to detain, and then when the resources were exsanguinated, they did what they had to do on a case-by-case basis in accordance with the law. I would love to make a correction to the record from earlier, if I could.
Please.
The Supreme Court did not rule on the lawlessness of the secretary, but lower courts did, and lower courts found him breaking the law, violating the laws, as it relates to his memorandum issued to ICE to tell them not to detain criminal felons, et cetera. What the Supreme Court did was rule on standing. They decided not to decide. But it's fascinating if you go to the oral arguments in that case, where even the Solicitor General, arguing on behalf of the Biden administration, says, and I paraphrase, my documents are here, but I'll just paraphrase it, essentially that the states don't have standing here. Congress is the one that handles these kinds of things. And Justice Kavanaugh actually says, I think your position, what you're saying is that Congress is the one. And I do have his quote here. Congress has to resort to shutting down the government or impeachment or dramatic steps. So she then replies, yes, with statutory regulatory violations, it's the Congress who holds. So that's what came out of the Texas versus the United States. States don't have standing. It's a blank check to Mayorkas as long as Congress doesn't act.
When faced with an executive branch that refuses to carry out the law, the options in front of Congress are what? It's the power of the purse.
We could defund, but then that gets us no border security.
It raises issues with respect to how you manage the funding issue. But the power of the purse is one tool.
That is correct.
The other tool is impeachment. And we'll come to that in a minute, right? Another tool is
or pass another law,
Or the third area is to pass another law, right? Now, true or false, under 212F currently, the President of the United States would have the emergency authority to shut down the border if he saw fit.
Yes, true.
Right, of course. And so when he declares this an emergency and he says he needs tools and so forth, he has the tools. He could stop it immediately, literally under existing law. Now, why do we need existing changes to existing law? Well, as we are trying to manage a system where we handle immigration, the current system is being exploited. I want to see if the gentleman agrees with this, where we have the general black letter law and spirit of the law that is security, right? Operational control of the border. You cannot come in without papers, right? Like that's the baseline. Then there's legal immigration. We'll invite you to come here. Here's some papers if you apply and you can get them and you're in the right line and the right standing. And then there's people who come here. And they come here and they try to claim something. True or false, this administration has been using asylum and parole as effectively a backdoor way to use those limited exceptions that are supposed to be predominantly case by case to use as effectively the exceptions that swallow the rule of security, right? That along with judge-made loopholes like Flores TVPRA with those complications. So those smaller provisions are being used to say, everybody come, make a claim, and get released. Is that a fair characterization in your observation?
Absolutely, and that's exactly what the lower court, that the Supreme Court chose not to overturn or make a decision on, exactly said that he had basically turned the whole immigration system upside down.
And the impact of that, right, just to see if these sounds correct to you, that of the sort of 3.3 million illegal aliens released into the United States since January of 21, the Biden administration failed to remove, through immigration court removal proceedings, roughly 99.7% of those illegal aliens. That compared to an average between FY17 and FY20 of 590,000 aliens encountered per fiscal year, we had over 1.4 million in 21, 2.3 million in 22, 2.4 million in 23. Impacts on cities and states. New York has spent $1.5 billion on the crisis. Texas has spent $12.5 billion on the crisis. Smuggling organizations estimate revenues increased from $500 million in 2018 to $13 billion in 2022. Immigration court backlog has increased from 1.3 million cases to 3 million cases. I could go on and on. The fentanyl numbers have gone from 4,800 pounds in fiscal year 20 to now we're in excess of, I think, 40,000 pounds or something in those rough estimates. And then the terror watch list, 11 total fiscal year 17 to 20. 331 total fiscal years 21 to 24 under Biden. So these are all concerning results, right, of open borders. Would the gentleman agree?
Absolutely.
And that's a fair characterization, plus more and stuff that you've got replete in all of the documentation of those numbers, and obviously they change on a monthly basis. I would ask, if I might, to introduce into the record 4 documents, because I've been working on this for a while, and to counter the point of the ranking member that this is somehow political. This is a response to President Trump. I mean, if the gentleman wants to give the president a call down to Mar-a-Lago and explain, you know, what I was doing in Iowa the last month, I'd appreciate him doing that. But I would say that in October of 21, I laid out a case in long form, laying out the case for impeaching Mayorkas in a 13-page memo to my Texas Republican colleagues. In March of 22, about 5 months later, I updated that memo to the entirety of the GOP colleagues. In July of 23, I wrote an op-ed in National Review titled "The Constitutional Case for Impeaching Mayorkas," and earlier this month, last month in January, I sent another memo updating the case for impeaching Mayorkas. Again, updating the numbers, keeping the general framework. I think the gentleman has seen some of that work. It's a result of work in Judiciary Committee. I'd ask all 4 of those to be entered in the record.
Without objection.
The reason I bring that up is because, far from being political, this was October of 21, 10 months into this administration, where if you go look at that memo where we lay out the stark shift from January of 21 to October of 21, it was blatantly clear that the Secretary of Homeland Security was ignoring the laws, and that ignoring of the law was endangering the people I represent. That was the fact of the matter. Would the gentleman agree with that, and not just Texas, but also the people of Tennessee and other people around the union?
100%.
And along those lines, in the articles that have been presented, the Secretary has willfully and systematically refused to comply with the law. Notably, for example, you have in here INA 235B, INA 236C, and a host of other statutes in which the Secretary is required, right, to faithfully execute the laws. True?
That is correct, yes.
And at some point, then that is the question. And to the gentleman from Colorado who raised the questions about, well, you know, what is the mens rea and what are the elements of the crime? Where in the Constitution, if the gentleman, the learned doctor, you don't have to be a legal scholar to be able to read the Constitution, where in the Constitution of the United States is there anything that mentions elements of the crime or mens rea with respect to impeachment?
It's not there.
It's not there.
Right.
Now, why might that be? Because it's a political document, right? This is a political question. Now, it is a political question based on law, right? Based on our understanding of how we want to apply the laws. But where in the Constitution are high crimes and misdemeanors defined? Is there a definition section in the back?
No.
that defines high crimes and misdemeanors. So where might we go to determine high crimes and misdemeanors, right? History, experience, try to figure out what it means. Now, my friend from Colorado, which was here, because I referred to him in the third person, he's not here, but raised, as I believe a couple of other of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle raised, and actually a couple of colleagues on this side of the aisle have raised, the question about maladministration, which I do think is an important question. Whether or not high crimes and misdemeanors was meant to include maladministration, or whether maladministration was specifically rejected. Now, I could be wrong, and I'm certainly open to be corrected for the record, because I think this is an interesting history. I don't know that it would be dispositive either way. But it is my understanding that it was in fact not rejected by vote, but rather when it was suggested by Colonel Mason, and I think seconded by Mr. Gary, that then there was a point raised by Mr. Madison that I believe the gentleman from Colorado quoted, "So vague a term will be equivalent to a tenure during pleasure of the Senate," end quote. And then there was some one-sentence debate here, and then Colonel Mason withdrew maladministration. It was not voted on. He withdrew maladministration and substitutes, quote, "other high crimes and misdemeanors." Now, the point of that was that it was not, in fact, rejected, and it was not defined. Of course, that is a then question about whether or not maladministration, what was the concern about it? Some of these debates would go back during the 90s, during the Clinton debates, about whether you have to have done something in your official capacity versus your personal capacity, and all of that has been a significant debate. But I would note, and ask to insert into the record a law review article here from Duke University, without objection.
Without objection.
That in here, the author writes, "A close reading of the Mason-Madison exchange discloses that it does not support either view in terms of the debate that they were having at the time. That first, the convention itself did not reject the term maladministration. Mason introduced the term and withdrew it after hearing Madison's objection. Because there was no vote, there was no opportunity for the delegates to adopt or reject Madison's concern. Second, according to Blackstone, British common law had developed a definition of high crimes and misdemeanors that included, but was not limited to, maladministration. The phrase also encompassed unofficial misconduct, etc., and it goes on. While Madison may not have known this, Mason apparently knew at least that it encompassed maladministration." Now, I'm not suggesting that I know exactly what they meant. I was not there. I am not suggesting that I think that it should or should not be a broad application of maladministration. That is a debate. But the simple truth is, it's up to us. So the question before us, I think, is one more of whether we open a door. We open a Pandora's box, right? That's the question that we would wrestle with here. The question here is whether the Secretary of Homeland Security has engaged in such conduct by ignoring the laws of the United States that you could reasonably suggest that he is violating his oath, right, to faithfully execute the laws of the United States, right? And on behalf of the president, for whom there is in fact phrasing in the Constitution that he must take care, right? And this, I think, is the center point of this entire debate. No one wants to have to go down the road of impeaching a secretary appointed and then confirmed by the Senate of the United States. I certainly don't want to do that. I assume the gentleman from Tennessee doesn't want to do that. Is that correct?
No.
Probably one of the last things you want to do, right?
Exactly.
And so people say, well, this is a big political, scalp. Look, I mean, I tweeted out today, not shockingly, contra some of the interests of my Republican colleagues, that I might find it interesting that some of my colleagues would very much appreciate being able to say they impeached Mayorkas, but not actually get funding removed and have a spending fight in order to stop what's happening at the border. I have no interest in doing that, and most of my colleagues have no interest in doing that. It's a question. It's an academic question. We're here, as you said at the beginning, about whether or not, in fact, I think the question was raised by the ranking member about something about a date, right, April of last year, and that you set out to do this and had some sort of mission to do this. And then there's some questions about whether or not, with respect to Mayorkas, about whether or not the fact that it might fail in the Senate or some other political questions. And your response, I think, was exactly right. I want to ask you to elaborate on it if you want, that we have a duty to do it. If we believe that there is, in fact, a public official who has a duty under law and under the Constitution to enforce it, we have a duty to call that secretary out, force him or her to the table, And then, in the absence of a response to the elected representatives of the people, take action. And you're either defunding or you're impeaching. And you're impeaching under whatever you believe the understanding is under the law on high crimes and misdemeanors. I believe that a violation of the oath, that rises to that level. For example, if the Attorney General of the United States were to order all of the Department of Justice, United States attorneys, stop prosecuting crimes. Just sit back, let everything run amok. Now, there might be a statute that violates. I'm not sure. I'd have to go comb through the statutes and say that. But that would be a gross violation of that individual's duty under the Constitution. And if the president wasn't asking for his or her resignation, do you not agree that it would be incumbent upon us to say, you can't do that?
If I could interject,
Sure.
though, the laws don't direct him to do it, right? There's no law that tells the DOJ you must go and capture every single murderer, but the law written by this body is very clear. You shall detain. And for criminal aliens, criminal felons, it's you shall detain all of them. And then there are directions to ICE about immediate deportation once it's determined they don't have an asylum claim that's legit. This secretary has not detained. In fact, has done everything he can to not detain and has not deported. The numbers are all plummeting. I mean, they're building systems and mechanisms to do just what the law.
Does his own admission of 85 to 90%, which he is on record in terms of people acknowledging that he said it in front of people that works for him in Texas, 85 to 90% of the people being released into the United States, does that comport at all with any understanding of how we're supposed to assess credible fear and make determinations before releasing the United States versus the law requiring detention?
Not at all, because he's created these alternative pathways that don't exist in law, that actually subvert the law's intent of a case-by-case basis to get to parole.
Does the gentleman, in addition to the secretary violating his oath, his duty to enforce the laws of the United States, is the gentleman aware of a instance in which the secretary lied or misrepresented the facts under oath before committees, before this body?
Yes, I am very aware of multiple statements by Secretary Mayorkas where he said, by the definition of operational control, that he and the department had operational control of the southern border. There are multiple episodes of that, and other instances where he said the border's been secure when clearly it's not secure. So, yeah.
Now, the response to that, as you would expect, right, from our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, and I would suggest maybe if it was in reverse, the response, if our side was trying to defend the secretary, is, well, those are vague terms, right? That, well, you know, when the secretary comes and he makes assertions about how he's carrying out his job and his perspective of it and that sort of notion of administration or maladministration. But I wonder if the gentleman might respond to the exchange that I had with the secretary, in which in April 19th, 2022 hearing in Judiciary Committee, I read word for word on a poster in the Judiciary Committee the statutory definition of operational control under the Secure Fence Act of 2006. Gentlemen, you're aware of that exchange, correct?
Yes, I am.
And I asked the secretary, quote, do you stand by your testimony that we have operational control in light of this definition? Now, I would just add here, I had already asked the question to set it up. He said we have operational control. I pulled up the chart, put the actual definition of operational control under the Secure Fence Act of 2006, and he replied, quote, I do. And Congressman, I think the Secretary of Homeland Security would have said the same thing in 2020 and 2019, end quote. Now, in a side note, as a conversation with Chad Wolf, the former secretary who appeared before the committee, I asked him that question. And he said, I very expressly never said such a thing. What I said was, we are making great progress to achieve what is trying to be accomplished under the Secure Fence Act to try to achieve that number. And for the record, they were doing that. They were trying to figure out how to enforce the law to drive those numbers down in accordance with the operational control definition. My point of bringing that up is because in March 28th of 2023, not quite a year later, Senate Judiciary Committee, in response to a question by Ranking Member Lindsey Graham on whether we have operational control of the border, the Secretary said, quote, with respect to the definition of operational control, I do not use the definition that appears in the Secure Fence Act, end quote. The Secretary's playing games, and he's playing games very specifically with those definitions so that he can give the appearance to the American people that the border is secure, because most people aren't following it like we are. Most people are just going about their daily life. They're taking their kids to games. They're going to their job. They're, paying the bills. They're going and getting the groceries. They don't follow all this stuff, but they see masses of people at the border and they wonder what the hell's going on. So then you go tell them, well, the President of the United States is just making unilateral decisions to let lots of people come into our country, which, by the way, is undermining our national security, undermining our security. And they say, well, that's crazy. Who would do that? Why would they do that? They're the president. They're the secretary. They're supposed to enforce the law. And then you come back and say, well, by the way, I had the secretary in front of me. That's my job. I asked him a question. I was very specific. I gave him lots of room. I said, well, surely if you look at this definition, you can't tell me you have operational control, Mr. Secretary. And he very boldly claimed that he did. And that is the problem, right? It is a snowing of the American people. There's further engagement with this that I won't belabor here because for time's sake, in which there's been abundance of, well, and this actually is important because in July of this last year, in the House Judiciary Committee, I questioned the Secretary again. After laying out the timeline of his previous statements, I asked, you looked straight in the American people, straight at me, straight at every person in this committee and said, we have operational control. Why? He said, you did not let me complete my answer. The Secure Fence Act defines operational control as not a single individual crosses the border. To which I said, I'm aware. I read it, and I read it to you, and you read it, and in fact, you said, I do. You didn't hesitate. You didn't say, I do. I need to explain what I mean by I do. You said, I do, over and over again. Any comments on that and what that gives in terms of your belief that the Secretary should be impeached?
Well, we clearly believe that a breach of trust of both Congress and the American people is fairly articulated in the Founding Fathers' description of high crimes and misdemeanors. We've actually had testimony from the minority witnesses in our committee that said breach of trust is a high crime and misdemeanor. I genuinely believe that when you lie to the American people, when you lie to the Congress under oath, that is a breach of trust. If you look at the impeachment articles that were drafted against Richard Nixon, they very clearly don't name him for committing any crime, but they do say for giving false testimony and for making false statements. So that was an article then. Clearly it's precedent, and that this secretary has lied to the American people on multiple occasions. The horsewhipping incident. I mean, the list goes on and on and on.
Yeah, last point.
And Congress under oath, too.
Last point, I'll raise that one. The secretary knew full well prior to issuing the statement about the alleged whipping incident in which, lifelong public servants, Border Patrol agents were being accused of the most vile and vicious, hateful, race-based kind of behavior. He, in fact, was made aware prior to the press conference that this was, in fact, not true. Is that true?
That is correct. He knew before he went out to the press conference, and then he lambasted those gentlemen.
And is that lying and mischaracterizing of the faithful public servants of DHS and Border Patrol agents, is that a violation of the public trust to drum up that kind of hatred?
Absolutely. It was clearly political.
The Secretary has, on numerous times, undermined border security, terminated border wall contracts. He sued Texas most recently, multiple times, frankly, and recently for trying to implement border security measures, and issued a memorandum that said the fact the individual is a removable alien should not be the sole basis of an enforcement action, which is basically rewriting the law by memorandum. I could go on and on. I think the main point here is, and I appreciate the chairman, I just want to push back on this notion that somehow this is, at least when I speak for myself, and I think for you, and I'll let you speak for yourself, that this is politically motivated. At the end of the day, I'll tell you this right now. If Secretary Mayorkas would call me up right now and say, you know what, I apologize for what I did to those migrants, those Haitian migrants. I should have been more careful in my definition with what I said to you in committee about what operational control is. We're going to fix this. We're going to go work with Texas. We're going to enforce the law. We're going to start detaining people. We're going to tell the world that we will detain you, legitimately, fully detain you. Otherwise, you're not coming in, because that's what our law contemplates. And we're going to do that, and we're going to send a message to the world so that cartels aren't empowered and people aren't going through this Darien Gap, traveling all the way up through Mexico with rape trees and people getting abused, and all the way through riding on the top of train cars, all the stuff that we're causing this to happen to Americans and to migrants in this false name of compassion, the secretary would call me up and say, hey, let's get busy. You're right. Let's enforce the law. I had no interest in having a scalp with respect to the Secretary of Homeland Security. What I really want is to make sure that we're doing our job. Does the gentleman agree?
Absolutely. You know, for me, that little baby crawling around on a VRBO that stumbled into fentanyl that had been left by the previous renter of the VRBO and died tells me that every American is unsafe with this open border. And I am passionately here because I believe it's the right thing to do.
Yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady from Indiana is recognized for whatever question she has for the panel.